If you are serious about watercolor painting and want to learn to paint like a pro, then you are in the right place. In this tutorial, I'll show you with step-by-step instructions how to paint this modern botanical painting. So as usual, I've traced down my line drawing like this. A really simple outline is all we need here, nothing too complicated. So to begin with, let me talk about the paper. This is Arches and it's a cold press, which means it's textured. And the paints I'm using are yellow ochre, permanent violet, indigo, green grey, olive, Vandyke brown and burnt umber, and there's a little mix here that I've done on the side of these two colours. The colours that I'm using today are from Mungyo, but please use whatever colours that you have in your palette. And the brushes I'm using are from Zen Art supplies. These are fine line brushes and in a selection of sizes, and I will link all the materials that I'm using in the description box underneath this video. This is the colour chart that I've made up from my set of paints, and I use this to match the colours to my painting, and I'll put an information card on the top of the screen should you want to make a similar one, and I'll show you how to use it. So watercolour is all about building up colours slowly and carefully, and it's really important that you allow each layer of paint to dry before you apply the next one. So let me show you how to paint this sycamore seed in really easy to follow steps to create this wonderful modern botanical painting. So I'm using my number 2 size round first of all to wet the paper like this. This means we are working wet in wet by applying the water to the paper, and then we're going to be dropping in the paint where we've applied that water. So take great care to apply the water inside the pencil line. Notice that I've got a small puddle of paint in my palette here. This means that I'm not dipping my brush into my big jar and overloading the brush with water. A little pro tip for you there. So you can see me here slightly out of shot, I'm afraid, just mixing permanent violet with a tiny bit of yellow ochre. Now this might seem like a really strange colour to use for our first wash, but trust me, it works. By layering the colours up slowly and carefully, we can create the depth of colour that we need. Now, if you are new to watercolour painting, I highly recommend that you watch this video right the way through until the end so that you can see that tricky process unfold. I'm dropping in these two colours as you can see here, and I'm working on every other section of the plant like this because I don't want the colours to run into each other whilst the paint and paper is still wet. So we have the yellow ochre and permanent violet mixed together like this, which creates a kind of muted tone for this element of the plant. I'm using the tip of my brush to push that paint into the pencil line just to make sure that it's nice and neat, and just blending it out as you can see. This is a mixture of just yellow ochre on its own, and this will form the base colour of all of the elements of the plant. Once I've applied the paint and it's settled into the paper, I'm just using a damp brush to blend the colours into the pencil line to make sure that the edges are nice and soft. So once that's dry, I can work on the other parts like this. So the first washes will be really watery, and it's just a template wash so that we know later on with our painting where we can go. It's just about working out which colours go where at this stage. Because I've wet the paper first of all and dropping in that colour, it just means that the paint is easier to handle. So now that everything's dry, I'm going to mix a couple of puddles on my palette here. I've cleaned it down and we are good to go. So once again, we have yellow ochre with the permanent violet. This time I'm going to mix it to a slightly thicker consistency. And a second puddle of olive green along with a puddle of green grey. And my little puddle of water to dip my brush into. Working on the green section of the plant like this in exactly the same way by wetting the paper first of all. Notice how I'm leaving the top half of this slightly lighter. It just means that it shows the light reflection from the top element of it like this. And you can see me dropping in the first layer of the other one, taking it right up to the pencil line of the section I've just painted, which really highlights the part that I've left out. It all makes sense in the end. So remember, it's just about building up our layers slowly and carefully. It's kind of working back to front with watercolour, figuring out the colours that are underneath your colours first so that you can build them up to a stronger consistency and layers later on. These brushes make light work of this painting. There are a selection of sizes in this set of 12 and I'm using the rounds in this painting tutorial today. There are various sizes ranging from I think a number 2, number 4, right down to a 0.5, but they are absolutely perfect for any fine detail work. And like I said, I'm going to link them in the description box underneath this video should you want to check them out for yourself. These are from Zen Art supplies, and they are one of the brands that I highly recommend. So working around these other elements like this, applying the paint directly onto the paper, wet on dry this time, because it's a slightly smaller element of the painting. And just taking this green-grey tone over the stem of the sycamore like this. You can see how easy it is to apply the paint with these little brushes. But remember, I always say it, use what you have. You can see I've mixed the same colours as before, this time in a much thicker consistency, and I'm starting to apply over the element of the sycamore like this, beginning to wiggle down a tiny little start of a vein. Now it's really important that we get these in place to build up a bit later on. You can see how I'm just blending that through with a fine brush. This time going back to wet and wet, where I'm just dropping in those two colours like this. So the colours that I have mixed on my palette, just to recap, are yellow ochre with permanent violet to a thicker consistency at the top, and we also have burnt umber to the side, as you can see there. Just outlining the top part with the permanent violet and yellow ochre to give it a more muted shade at the top like this, and then once again pulling it down using the wiggling motion to start the beginnings of the veins that we're going to be painting in a lot later on. Remember, this is just our template that we're building on later. And just dropping in a tiny bit of that burnt umber with the tip of my brush whilst that paint is still damp. Now, if there are any colours that I'm using within this tutorial that you don't have and you would like to join in, drop me a line in the comments below and tell me the colours that you have, and I'll see if I can help you in any way. And just continuing this process for the second glaze. So we are working both wet and wet and wet and dry for this tutorial. So you can see me just using a tiny bit of a water glaze to begin with, whilst I'm dropping in that permanent violet and yellow ochre tone. just repeating the process on this element using the permanent violet and yellow ochre mix. And you can see how I'm starting to create the shapes, leaving some gaps in between so that we can still see that first wash underneath. Making sure that everything's dry, turning my attention to the next part. Using wet and wet once again. And then just dropping in the burnt umber mix like this. So at the beginning of this tutorial, you may have seen some text saying that we have a free line drawing and reference photograph to accompany this tutorial. Indeed, all of our tutorials here on YouTube, and you can access them by joining our Facebook group. I'll put the link in the description box underneath this video, so do consider joining us there. We are an incredible bunch of people, and you can post your finished paintings there and have some feedback from me and our other members if you want to. And like I said, you can have access to all of the line drawings and reference photographs so that you can paint along with us here on YouTube. So once again, working wet and wet, dropping it in the burnt umber mix like this, letting it blur naturally into that paper. As always, once I've applied the paint, I clean my brush in the water, pat it on the kitchen paper, and then just blend it through like this to soften up any hard edges. And I repeat the process on the other section. Now, if you are finding value in this video, you may want to consider subscribing and hitting that bell notification. That way you won't miss any free tutorials coming out every Tuesday. Or you can follow us on Instagram at The Wonders of Watercolour, where we have behind the scenes content and upcoming tutorials on there. You may want to give this video a thumbs up. It's a free way of letting YouTube know that you like my content. So once again, working wet and wet, and this time I'm applying the more muted tone of yellow ochre and permanent violet to this element here with a tiny bit of Vandyke brown mixed in. So you can see that the colour is slightly darker on this element, and I'm going to be taking it down the outside edge. And you can see, because the paper is damp, how that paint naturally splurges into the lighter colour, which once again will form the base of the veins that we're going to be putting a little later on. And I'm beginning once again to blend up those colours like this. And just pulling up those veins to begin with. And the same on the other side. You can see me here using my flat synthetic brush to tidy up any messy edges and blur the colours together. Now, if botanical painting is your thing, we have a Patreon site where you can learn to paint botanicals in more detail. Every single month we do a brand new botanical painting tutorial that are completely different from the ones that are here on YouTube, as well as weekly vlog type videos. So if you do want to take a look, I will link it in the description box underneath this video, and it's also a way that you can support my channel. So back to the job in hand. You can see me mixing here burnt umber, and I've decided to add a little bit of a treat for my painting today. These are my handmade watercolours from A Gallo. Now, if you don't have this particular colour that I've chosen, this is Quinacridone Red Gold. Don't worry, you can continue with burnt umber, but I just wanted to give it a little bit of a a zhuzh, and just to add this colour, just to show you that if you have got something like this within your palette, you can really make your painting sing. So I'm going to be dropping in a tiny bit of that here and there, but like I said, don't worry if you don't have it, but if you do, Quinacridone Red Gold from A Gallo is a wonderful colour and a real treat to use. But in the meantime, going back to this top element here, repeating the process exactly the same as before, only adding the mid-tones this time, both wet in wet and wet in dry, as you can see me doing here, working around those lighter areas with the tip of my number 2.0 brush. I'm using the mix of green grey and also purple. So we've got green, grey and permanent violet on the bottom there with a tiny bit of Vandyke brown to create the darker element, as you can see, and once again enhancing those veins. So this is green, grey, permanent violet with a tiny bit of Vandyke brown. Notice the consistency of the paint that I have in my palette is slightly thicker now, but not so thick that I can't use it. I'm working around this tiny little highlight that we've created on the first part of the sycamore seed. So I'm wetting the paper, wet and wet again, on just the top part of the sycamore seed here, picking up the Quinacridone Red Gold and applying it over the wash that we've done earlier on of burnt umber. You can see how this really gives it another level of vibrancy. If you did want to give your painting a little bit more of a sparkle like this, you could maybe use something like Quinacridone Gold mixed in with a tiny bit of Quinacridone Red, perhaps that could work. But it really doesn't need it. It's just a treat, as I said, and I had it within my mix, and I very rarely get the opportunity to use my A Gallo paints here on YouTube because I'm usually using Mungyo paints or also paints from Zen Art, which I really like. But for today, this is what we're using. And I just wanted to show you how it can make a difference to your painting. So once again, going back to the top part of this sycamore seed here, and we have the mix permanent violet, olive and Vandyke brown, and now I'm using the tip of my brush to outline the edge here, as you can see, just to tidy up any messy edges and just give it a little bit more drama like this to enhance it and make it stand out from the white of the paper. When I'm applying the darker tone, notice that I'm not taking the colour right the way to the top of that part there, wanting to keep it light. So it's really important that you have a good strong colour as well as tonal variations within your painting. You want a light tone, a mid-tone and a dark tone of your colours to really make your paintings come to life. So once again, going back to this top element here, applying water like this, and I'm going to be dropping in some of the darker tone on the top. Once that paint has settled, and you can see me here, just using that flat brush to lift out that little highlight that I lost. Really simply just pressing on the paper with my brush and just patting it dry with a tiny bit of kitchen paper like this. And that retains the highlight. So I've mixed a tiny puddle of Vandyke brown along with the first wash of yellow ochre, and I'm applying this in a simple glaze over this part of the sycamore seed. I felt that it was looking a little bit too pale and needed a tiny bit of a yellow tone, so this is what I'm doing here. Because we've built up our colours slowly and carefully in really thin layers, we now have the ability to build up those colours. Had we gone in too quickly with too much colour, it would turn to mud and look really untidy and overworked. But because we have thinner layers, you can see how easy it is to apply the colours and create the colours that we want. I pointed there to a little splash of colour on my paper where my paint had flicked onto the paper, and I'm going to show you in a second how I remove that. But for now, I'm just dropping in some more of the yellow ochre on this part here. This is a magic eraser. You can buy them in any sort of homeware stores. You just use them wet, put it into some water, and then just literally use it to scrub away at your mark and pat it dry like this. A really good way if you splashed any paint onto your paper. A word of warning though, once you've done that, you really can't paint over it because it does obviously agitate the paper and make it unworkable, so that you can only use it on any areas of the paper that are completely clean. So going back to this one here, once again, working wet and wet, dropping in that darker mix, so it's permanent violet and yellow ochre, with a tiny bit of Vandyke brown, and just letting it splurge into the water. Now where this is forming its gaps naturally, I'm going to be using that to my advantage later on. But for now, I'm using the outside of my brush to sharpen up that edge and just gently manipulate that paint into the damp paper like this. So it's really important that every element of your painting is dry before you apply paint to the next bit. Otherwise, your watercolour paint will naturally sort of blur into that element. So make sure that each bit is dry before you start applying it. So the same process as before. Once I've applied that darker colour, I'm using it to pull into this beginnings of some veins. So this is the Quinacridone Red Gold from A Gallo that you can see me applying here to give it a little bit more vibrancy and a little bit more dramatic. But I'm not taking the colour all the way through, and you can see me once again just blending that colour in. Now notice there's a tiny bit of Quinacridone Red Gold here. That's because my paint wasn't dry and I had to remove it like this. Very, very simply, just by patting it dry with some kitchen paper. I've cleaned down my palette, and I'm going to be mixing some darker tones of exactly the same colours that we used before. So we have Burnt Umber and Vandyke Brown on its own, and the two green colours on the side here. And I'm going to just add a tiny bit of the permanent violet to the Vandyke Brown. We're going to be using these colours to paint in the veins. And tidy up the outside edges as well. It's a little bit time consuming, but I know that many people really like this part of the painting. And when I was teaching one-on-one and in groups, a lot of the students said that this was their favourite part. You can see me just adding the beginnings of the darker colours. Make sure that your paint is completely dry before you do this. It has to be bone dry. Otherwise, your paint will just merge into the washes that you already had. So it has to be dry, using a very fine brush. You can see me outlining the paint that I put in place earlier on. The paint on the palette does need to be thicker than the initial washes at this point. You can see by using the tip of the brush and a very fine pressure, I can get a needle-like quality with the paintbrush, making it super sharp to outline any areas that I feel are a little bit untidy and to enhance them like this. So I'm just adding some of the purple and brown colour here to enhance this part, and you can see how it makes the highlight of the adjoining sycamore seed really jump out. And blending it through with that damp brush as before. Now when you start to apply your veins to each part of the sycamore seed, make sure that you use the correct colour for each part. For example, I wouldn't use the orangey brown tone here because it wouldn't look right. And also it's really important that when you hit the lighter part of your sycamore seed that you add more water to your mix so that it looks light. You don't want a dark colour vein on a light area of your plant. It just wouldn't look right. It would look unnatural. So keep an eye on your reference photograph and have a look to see where your veins become lighter, and make sure that you add a tiny bit of water to your mix to lighten up the colour on your palette. So you can see me here just using a really light touch, just painting in some veins. Now I'm not going to paint in every single vein exactly the same as the photograph. I'm just kind of using my imagination, painting these veins in the direction that I believe they are going to be going, because there are thousands of them and it would be a job that would take forever. So I'm just kind of using my discretion and just putting them in one by one here, taking a lighter pressure on the lighter area here, as I've said earlier. It's because there was very little paint on my brush, I can just really barely see the colour, but I know it's there, and I'll enhance that a bit later. Just taking my time, and I'm also, you'll see that I've outlined that element of the sycamore seed just to sharpen up that edge, and I really like that. I think that it gives it a really modern look, so it's kind of modern botanical painting. And just making up squiggly lines, as you can see here. And notice how that lighter area towards the middle left of the sycamore seed is really standing out now. Using the very tip of my brush. Any fine brush that you have will do for this, but I'm using the 0.2, I think it is a 0.2, sorry, it's a 5.0 to outline this. It's 5.0 that I'm using here, and you can see I'm just adding a darker tone to that part there and sharpening up that area. And I'm going to do the same for the other two, as you can see here. And I've left two as they are so that you can see me doing it again. Notice on the middle part here, this kind of muted tone one, where I've really taken advantage of those gaps in my paint and outlined them. I really love the look that this gives. It gives it a really modern sort of contemporary feel. So I've mixed up the colour again. This is the purple colour that we had earlier on with a little bit of the burnt umber. And I'm really sharpening up those edges now, and I'm going to be using these colours once again to complete the other two parts of the sycamore seed. You don't have to outline your plant as I'm doing here, but like I said, I really like that look. I think it gives it that sort of modern botanical painting look. Using this brush to outline as before, and also taking it over any elements of my sycamore seed that I feel need sharpening up, including these the stems like this. And I'm using the dark purple mixed to enhance any areas that I feel need sharpening and darkening at the same time. Working around the central part here. And just adding a tiny bit of detail to this part here. And just blurring it through as before. So I'm now going to start painting the veins into this part of the seed here. You can see what I mean by making use of the parts where that paint has naturally settled into the paper, working around it as if it's meant to be that way. When we applied the paint wet and wet to begin with, it naturally settled into the paper into this shape, so I'm now enhancing it, making it look deliberate. Also taking that darker colour where the colour is naturally darker towards the top side and a lighter tone towards the bottom where there's less paint on my brush, making it look realistic. And that really light touch as I hit that lighter colour. Just continuing the process, and I'm also outlining the outside edge like this to tidy up the edge and also give it that sharpness that I really like. And I'll continue the process on the other section in a moment, making sure that the outside edge of this is dark enough before I proceed. So now that everything's dry, I'm just going over any elements that I feel need strengthening or darkening. Remember I said that the tonal variations, the tonal values are also important. So I'm just dropping in a few bits of the darker values here and there until I'm happy that it's got the tonal values that are correct. There's still a little bit of work to do on this painting, but I'm going to stop talking and let you listen to some music until it's complete. At the end of this video, I will put up a playlist of botanical paintings so that you can have a look at all the different botanical paintings tutorials that we have here on YouTube. So click through and I'll see you there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.